Hi friends, this is Shekhar Srinivasan, and in this video we shall understand how do you call a base constructor in C#. This is one of the most frequently asked questions for the freshers. So let's try to understand with a proper demo. Let me just add a class called base constructor. For the visibility, let me increase the font size. Let's assume that what exactly happens when we create a inheritance of one class to the other. Say that we have a class called as base class, which is just having a 0 argument constructor. I mentioned 0 argument base class constructor is invoke. And assume that you have a parameterized constructor also, something like string name. Parameterized constructor is invoked by I just specify this. So we have a class with the name called as base class, which is having two constructors. One is 0 argument constructor and the other one is a parameterized constructor. Let's assume that I create a class with a name called as subclass inherits base class. Now within this, assume that I have a 0 argument constructor. I say 0 argument subclass constructor is invoke. And I try to say subclass string name parameterized constructor is invoked by some name. So assume that we have a subclass which is having two constructor. One is a 0 argument constructor, the other one is a parameterized constructor. Now let's try to understand what will happen when we create an object for the subclass. So subclass sc equal to new subclass. So I'm just trying to create an object for the subclass without using any arguments. Now whenever I try to execute this thing by making this as startup, we can just try to observe it. When I create an object for the derived class or the subclass, we can always observe that by default base class 0 argument constructor is invoked. So anytime we create an object for the derived class, the base class 0 argument constructor will be invoked. Next, assume that I try to create an object for the subclass by passing the parameters. So I say subclass sc1 and I just pass the parameter value called as Shekhar. Now I'm creating an object for the subclass by taking the parameter. Now when I just try to execute this, we can just try to observe it. In the first case, when I created an object for the subclass without passing any parameters, then base class 0 argument constructor is invoked, and the other one is for the subclass also we got 0 argument subclass constructor is invoked. And when you create an object for the subclass, we can just observe it. By default 0 argument base constructor is invoked and then parameterized constructor is invoked. So if we get a question saying that when you create an object for a derived class, which base class constructor is invoked? By default, when we create an object for the subclass, base class 0 argument constructor is invoked. But in case if the question is how do you call a specific base class constructor when you create an object for the subclass? For example, if we just try to observe the output once again, when I created an object for the subclass by passing the parameter, I'm still find that base class 0 argument constructor is invoked. So how do you call a specific base class constructor when you create an object for subclass? So what we have to do is, if this is the requirement, then when you create an object for the subclass or constructor for the subclass, we need to simply use colon base, and we can just try to specify which base class constructor you need to invoke. So whenever you create an object for the subclass, to specify which base class constructor needs to be invoked, we have to simply use colon base and a name. Now let me just try to execute this. We can understand that parameterized constructor is invoked by Shaker and also here. So the first one is from the parameterized base class. I can say parameterized subclass constructor is invoked, and I can just mention parameterized base class constructor. Let me execute once again. So you can just try to observe it. Parameterized base class constructor is invoked by Shaker, and parameterized subclass constructor is invoked by Shaker. Sometimes there will be another question saying that when you try to invoke the base class constructor, I need to perform some kind of manipulations for that particular thing. For example, like say I am trying to pass a lowercase name here. When it is going to be invoked at the base class, I wanted to change its case. To understand this, what I try to do was, let's assume that in the subclass or in the base class, I try to add a property with the name called as name. And within the base class, what I try to do was, I say this dot name equal to name. So in the base class, I have a property now with the name, and within the base class parameterized constructor, I am trying to set the name for that. Now what I try to do is, I just say public subclass string name colon base of name. Now let me just try to check out. If I try to check the value for this thing, the name sc1 dot the name. Now if I just try to check out, I get a value called as name as Shaker. But assume that I wanted to convert that name into an uppercase and then I wanted to set the value. Then what we can do is, whenever you try to invoke the base class constructor, you can also pass this particular thing to a method. Like say for example, I say convert to upper. So C# uses right to left execution process, and hence what I can do is, I can use a method which will be a public static method, and since I wanted to return a string, we have a string. So I can simply say return name dot to upper. So what this is going to do is, whenever you're going to create an object for the derived class, it will try to invoke the base class parameterized constructor, and when it is going to pass the value, whatever the value I'm trying to pass, that will be first given to a method called as convert to upper. Whatever the manipulations needs to be done, those manipulations will be done, and that manipulated updated data will be passed to the base class constructor. Now if I try to execute this, we can see that the name is Shaker, and you can see that for this particular base class constructor, the value Shaker is being passed in uppercase, whereas parameter subclass constructor is invoked by Shaker in lowercase. So let's try to have a small summary on this particular things. The expected questions from this is, when an object is created for the derived class or subclass, which base class constructor is invoked? Base class 0 argument constructor. how to call a specific base class constructor. Use colon base and argument info while defining the derived class constructor. If base class doesn't have a zero argument constructor, and if an object is created for the derived class, error will be raised. For example, let's say that we have a base class constructor and you say that there is no base class zero argument constructor. When there is no base class zero argument constructor, when you try to observe this thing, we will get a error. The reason for this is when you create an object for the derived class, then by default it will check for the base class constructor. Now in the subclass, if you just try to observe it, the zero argument constructor of subclass is not having any parameter. So as a result, what happens is it will try to search for the base class zero argument constructor, and hence it will try to say that since the base class does not have a zero argument constructor, you get an error. To overcome this, once again I can pass some parameter like this. Then what happens is for the derived class, you will get zero argument subclass constructor is invoked, and for the base class it will go for the parameterized constructor. Now let me just try to execute this. So you can see that parameterized base class constructor is invoked by Shaker and zero argument subclass constructor is invoked. Hope this video given you a clear idea on understanding the following questions. If you like this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. This encourages me to develop more and more videos. Thank you, yours Shaker.